Okay, let's dive right into this full summary of an absolutely fascinating study from the Barley Harvest YouTube channel. It's titled One Fire, Two Fates. And hey, you can find a link to the original source right below this video if you want to check it out for yourself. Today, we're really going to break down some deeply layered historical and scriptural concepts. We're unpacking how ancient prophecies might literally, and I mean literally, map onto the very foundations of our modern world. It's a wild ride through history, so let's just get right into it.
The source kicks things off with a super provocative question. What kind of fire actually eats rock? I mean, really think about it for a second. If you build a campfire out in the woods, what do? You instinctively use a ring of stones to contain the flames, right? Because natural stone simply doesn't burn. So when ancient texts speak of a fire that completely consumes even the stones, well, we aren't talking about a normal, natural blaze here. We're talking about an unnatural, deeply scriptural fire. A fire that doesn't just blindly destroy, but rather, as the study posits, actively tests everything it touches. It's seeking out a very specific kind of fuel.
The study anchors its entire thesis on this really specific, almost surreal prophecy from Zechariah chapter 5. It describes this massive flying scroll that acts as a curse, literally entering a house to consume its timber and its stones. But here's the catch. It doesn't just attack random houses. The study points out a critical, absolutely crucial detail. This text binds two very specific marks together: theft and a false oath sworn in God's name. So this scroll is actively hunting for structures that are built on those two intertwined actions.
Applying these two marks to the largest historical scales first, the source points to a story we've literally all heard. You know the one, the famous myth that the island of Manhattan was bought from native tribes for a mere $24 in beads and trinkets. But guys, here is where the history gets genuinely shocking. As the study highlights, that exact $24 figure, it didn't even exist in the 17th century record. No way! It was entirely manufactured over 200 years later, in 1846. A historian literally just converted an old Dutch figure into 19th century dollars. He completely ignored centuries of inflation and brushed past the rather glaring lack of any original deed to prove it.
Because of this massive historical blind spot, the study argues that this incredibly murky land transaction is essentially the missing paper trail of Wall Street itself. There is literally no actual bill of sale. Instead, what you had was a transaction occurring between peoples with entirely different concepts of reality and ownership. You had one side believing they were welcoming neighbors, and the other boldly claiming, hey, we just purchased an island. The study suggests this wasn't a clean purchase at all. It was actually a taking, with a really convenient story told over the top of it, which essentially laid the geographic and moral foundation for our entire modern global financial system.
And this wasn't just an isolated incident. The source impartially traces how historical empires legally justified this massive, systemic theft through formal divine decrees over centuries. They were effectively weaponizing theology for territorial gain. Way back in 1452 and 1493, papal bulls formally authorized the taking of lands and peoples, supposedly for the glory of Christendom. Fast forward a bit to 1823, and you have the U.S. Supreme Court ruling in Johnson versus Minshaft, legally justifying conquest. Astonishingly, the ruling explicitly called the introduction of Christianity an apology, which, in that specific context, meant a legal justification for taking the entire continent.
This history brilliantly illustrates the study's central point. It's not that America necessarily took more land than other empires. Rather, it made, and eventually broke, significantly more promises. The sheer numbers here are absolutely staggering. To put it into perspective, the U.S. ratified roughly 370 treaties. Compare that to Canada's 70 or Australia's 0. But as the source notes, whenever gold was discovered in the hills, or whenever railroads needed to come pushing through a territory, those solemn oaths were almost universally broken. This perfectly binds the dual marks of the Zechariah scroll together: massive, systemic theft, wrapped neatly in a broken oath.
Now, the crucial point the source makes here is that this isn't simply about pointing fingers at one specific nation's villainy. Not at all. It's about identifying a historic, global pattern. It is an old wickedness. It's that exact same reach for what isn't yours, constantly justified in the language of divine right. This pattern has moved westward through virtually every empire since Babel, constantly claiming heaven's blessing on territorial expansion. The study argues that America just happened to be the geographic location where this oldest taking finally hit the ocean and literally ran out of frontier. Okay, so transitioning from the history to the theological metaphors, the study draws a really stark contrast between historical divine judgments and future ones. Historically, Scripture says God judged the earth by water in the Great Flood. But think about it, a water judgment leaves structural remnants behind. Water moves around things.
Scripture, however, points to a prophesied final judgment by a fervent fire, one so incredibly intense that the texts say the elements themselves shall melt. We are moving from a judgment of water that washes into a judgment of unnatural fire that consumes absolutely everything structural at a molecular level.
To truly understand how this specific fire operates, the source vividly juxtaposes two very different biblical events. First, you have the strange fire of Nadab and Abihu in Leviticus. They falsely acted in God's name by bringing an unauthorized offering, and they were instantly destroyed by it. Now contrast that with the true fire at Mount Carmel. There, the prophet Elijah drenched his altar in water 3 times over, just to prove a point. Yet when the true fire of God fell, it didn't just burn the wood, it entirely consumed the sacrifice, the wood, the water, and astonishingly, the very stones of the altars themselves.
The study explains that when this ultimate divine fire finally falls, it doesn't just indiscriminately destroy like some random forest fire. Instead, it asks every single thing it touches one singular probing question: what are you actually made of? It tests the very material of a living stone, which Scripture often uses as a metaphor for people, to see if it truly belongs to the Lord. Fire, in this scriptural context, is an ultimate refining mechanism. It safely removes what was genuinely offered to God and violently consumes what only falsely claimed to be His.
This leaves us with 2 very distinct types of stones: altar stones and building stones. The source explains that altar stones live their entire lives intimately close to the fire. They are entirely given over to God right from the start, so when that final fire falls, they are wholly consumed and taken up without any resistance. Building stones, on the other hand, while they might be structurally impressive, they might look super shiny on the outside, but they are complete strangers to the fire. When the flame finally hits them, they might survive, but they lose absolutely all of their worldly works in the process.
The study leans on a really striking verse from 1 Corinthians to illustrate this. It interprets the building stone as a representation of someone who is genuinely saved, but ultimately completely stripped bare by the fire. Because they built their lives with wood, hay, and stubble, all of it just burns away. They escape exactly like someone sprinting empty-handed from a burning house in the middle of the night. Think about that image. They possess their life and their ultimate salvation for sure, but they are holding absolutely nothing else to show for their entire time on earth.
Now watch how the source masterfully zooms inward here. This concept doesn't just apply to ancient empires. The study applies Zechariah's curse of theft and false oaths across 3 distinct nested houses. Step 1 is the macro level, that massive global system of empires and treaties we were just discussing. But then step 2 shrinks the lens down to the house of God, meaning the institutional church itself. And finally, step 3 brings it all the way down to the most intimate level possible, the individual body, you. The scroll is hunting for the exact same 2 marks of theft and false oaths at every single one of these scales.
Addressing that second house, the study neutrally observes how the institutional church historically, and even currently, sometimes embodies these exact marks. It happens by mishandling trust and money gathered in God's name, or by using and discarding actual people under the guise of ministry. But perhaps most dangerously, the study argues it happens through falsely swearing by God's name. Like casually using the phrase, "God told me," to shut down an argument, manipulate a situation, or justify purely human ambitions. That is the literal definition of theft and a false oath operating right inside the walls of the church.
Zooming all the way in to the most intimate scale, the study asks us to deeply reflect on the first house, our own individual lives. The source challenges us to consider if we, in our own bodies and daily choices, commit this ancient theft by forcibly stamping God's will onto our own personal desires. Have we taken what wasn't actually ours to take? Have we called our own stubborn will obedience to God? It's a heavy thought. The source posits that the exact same curse that judges massive global empires is actively looking for those exact same marks right in our own hearts.
And honestly, here's the really sobering part. The study emphasizes that this testing fire doesn't begin out in the secular world. Rather, Scripture dictates that divine judgment in the sorting process must start first with believers. It starts at the house of God. The scroll knocks on the believer's door before it goes anywhere else. The source points out that the faithful are tested, sorted, and drawn out first, proving their true dedication to the fire, long before the judgment is ever unleashed on the house of the thief. Using the biblical story of Lot escaping Sodom as a template, the source argues that God's fiery judgment actually involves 2 simultaneous motions. First, the righteous are drawn out as a proof of their faith. But here is the critical part to understand.
The presence of the righteous was the only thing holding the judgment back in the first place. Therefore, drawing them out is preservation for the righteous, absolutely, but it simultaneously acts as the total removal of restraint for the wicked. It opens the door for the fire to finally fall.
Which brings us to a powerful, unavoidable question posed by the original author at the end of this study. As that flying scroll sweeps across the earth, reading the foundation of every single house, which house will you be found in? Are you an altar stone, wholly given over and comfortable with the fire? Or are you a building stone, holding tightly to worldly works that are destined to burn? It really leaves us to independently weigh this compelling historical and spiritual narrative and ask ourselves what kind of stones we truly are. Thanks for learning with us today, and keep exploring.